The first of our sponsors is the Colonel Leslie Callahan Fund, a memorial fund. Colonel Callahan was a West Point graduate who started his military career at the very end of World War II, served in the Philippines, made a career of the Army, ending up as a colonel, and then came here as a professor of industrial and systems engineering. As you all know, we have one of the truly premier departments of that kind in the world. And on his death, he left an endowment which the family continues to support to help promote and encourage military and national security studies. And they sponsor or co-sponsor quite a number of things on this campus, and Jan Lodell's talk is one of them this year. The second sponsor, as is very evident from your refrigerator magnets and the video that you have in front of you, is the Daisy Foundation. And we're very pleased to have here Bruce Roth, who is the founder and the executive director of the Daisy Foundation. Bruce really has a day job. In fact, he has multiple day jobs. In particular, he's the president of Roth and Associates, which is, as he describes it, an employee benefits brokerage and consulting firm in Atlanta. And he is also a principal at ERISA Pros, a provider of welfare benefit plan compliance services. And finally, well, not really finally, but it's the last thing I'll say about him, the president of the Coordinated Capital Corporation, a registered investment advisor. But Bruce's real passion is concern over weapons of mass destruction, and it's in that capacity that he helped establish the Daisy Foundation. And among other things that they do, they are sponsoring this talk here. And one thing I should actually... One of Bruce's notable achievements is this book, appropriately titled No Time to Kill, with that wonderful painting by Salvador Dali with all the melting clocks and what have you on the front page. And if any of you are interested in this book, I have a copy. You're welcome to look at it, and I'm sure Bruce can find ways for you all to acquire copies. And without any further ado, and we'd like to move on, of course, to get Jan speaking, and that's the reason you're really all here. Bruce, would you like to take over? And I think we have a little slideshow for you as well.
Good afternoon, and welcome to today's discussion with Jan Lodell about, as a recent article in Survival magazine, the next step in nuclear arms control, a nuclear control regime. And to thank you, students, professors, and friends, for dedicating your valuable time to come and learn more about this important and timely subject. Thank you to Georgia Tech Sam Nunn School of International Affairs, to the Center for Strategy, Technology, and Policy, and to the Callahan Memorial Endowment. Daisy Alliance is a nonpartisan peace organization that focuses on nuclear arms control. We educate the public about the devastation these weapons are capable of inflicting and the threat they pose to civilization. Daisy Alliance seeks to improve global peace and security by reducing the threat of weapons of mass destruction through the rule of international law. And before we begin, I'd just like to play a short clip to help you visualize the effects of these weapons. Admittedly, some of those numbers were a few years out of date. I made that movie a few years ago. But the materiality of the information is still there. Now, it's my honor to introduce our featured guest. Jan Lodel is a prominent figure in nuclear arms control in civil society and has extensive experience in nuclear security issues. He served as Principal Deputy Under Secretary of Defense for Policy in the Clinton administration, on Henry Kissinger's staff as a Deputy for Program Analysis under the Nixon and Ford administrations, and as Director of the NATO and General Purpose Force Analysis Division in the Office of the Secretary of Defense, Robert McNamara, during the Johnson administration. Mr. Lodel is a member of the Council on Foreign Relations and the International Institute on Strategic Studies. He previously served as the Executive Director of the Aspen Study Group and is a recipient of Rice University's Distinguished Alumnus Award for Public Service and Achievement in Business. He was twice awarded the Department of Defense Medal for Distinguished Public Service, the department's highest civilian honor. Let's welcome Jan.
You saw here the difficulty, the challenge we have from nuclear weapons. We know about that. We know how horrible the use of nuclear weapons would be. I think what's not so well known is that nuclear weapons are no longer very hard to make. The technology is out of the bag. It's dispersed throughout the world. And the only way to prevent terrorists or proliferators from making nuclear weapons in today's world is to keep them from getting nuclear weapon material. Nuclear weapon material consists of either plutonium or highly enriched uranium. Those are the two things you can use to make nuclear weapons. There are a few other potential theoretical, those of you who might be physical chemists here would argue with me a bit. But basically, well, not basically, today, those are the only two materials that you can use to make nuclear weapons. A lot of people don't realize that neither of those two materials exist in nature. As far as we know, they're only here on Earth. Maybe some other intelligent civilization somewhere in the universe has created plutonium or created highly enriched uranium. Uranium in nature never gets more than less than 1% of the isotope of uranium-235, which is the one you need for nuclear weapons. To build a nuclear weapon, you need about 85% purity of uranium-235 in order to build a nuclear weapon from uranium. Plutonium doesn't exist at all. It's a man-made element. It's not even on the periodic table before 1943, I guess, was about the time we had our first reactors that made any plutonium on Earth. So, in principle, these materials ought to be able to be controlled by we humans, since these things don't exist at all in nature. But we've made a whole lot of this stuff. And I would just call to your attention two numbers that I'd like you to remember. The number 4 million and the number 40. Well, pretty simple math there. 4 million is 100,000 times 40. 4 million is the number of pounds of nuclear weapon material that exists on Earth, approximately. And 40 is the number of pounds of nuclear weapon material you need to make a bomb, approximately. So, we have enough nuclear weapon material to make 100,000 bombs. And it's spread pretty much all over the world. Now, why do I say pretty much all over the world? Because the nuclear power industry creates these materials and uses these materials as well. And many countries who do not have nuclear weapons have nuclear weapons material on their territory. They have the capacity to make nuclear weapons material. There are 11 nations that can separate and make pure plutonium out of their nuclear power plant waste. And they do this in order to recycle this nuclear power plant waste plutonium back into their nuclear power plants, which is one way of cutting down the amount of uranium you have to mine and use to make a power plant. And they also use it for medical purposes and a lot of other purposes. So there's a lot of this nuclear weapon material laying around the world. I say laying around, that's perhaps a bit overly dramatic, but there's a lot of it out there. If you count all of the plutonium that's tied up in nuclear weapon waste, which until it's reprocessed, you can't make weapons out of it, there's enough already on Earth for 400,000 nuclear weapons. How much do we need? 40 pounds. How many nuclear weapons does it take for a terrorist to build a weapon? How many nuclear weapons does it, for terrorists to get, does it take for us to have a catastrophic change in world affairs? Probably one. One nuclear weapon put on a pleasure boat, driven into any harbor in the world, or delivered by any of a number of other means by a terrorist organization, doing vast amounts of destruction, probably killing 100,000 people immediately, maybe 500,000, putting a city out of commission for a long period of time would be disastrous. Now, while many of the threats that you saw in the movie still exist, they are certainly not of the same immediacy as they were at the time that President Johnson raised this issue and showed his famous commercial of the girl with the daisy. Today, the real threat comes from terrorists getting hold of nuclear material and making a bomb and using it because they would. Right now, we don't have a political incentive for any nation to start a nuclear war. We have risks of nuclear war, and we have Iran trying to build nuclear weapons, and we have North Korea with some crude nuclear weapons. So these are not trivial things. They are risks. They have to be dealt with, and we have a strong policy of deterrence to deal with this. We have other means for dealing with them as best we can. So the threat is much reduced from the Cold War. There's a dramatic improvement since the Cold War is over. Now that my slides are up here, let me reiterate just a couple of these things with the slides, just to make them a little bit more dramatic. How did we get to where we are today? We started out with the United States building the first nuclear weapons in 1945. By 4 years later, mostly through espionage, the Soviet Union had them. With help from us, Canada and the United Kingdom got them right away, and France came along. China built theirs because they saw threats from both the United States and from the Soviet Union in those days, and they felt they had to have nuclear weapons to deter a potential use from the Soviet Union. Some people believe that the Soviet Union built theirs because they saw a threat from the United States, because we had nuclear weapons. So you begin to see here this chain of what happens. One power gets nuclear weapons. Another power realizes that it can't really defend against these weapons. There is no defense, direct defense against these weapons. So the only way they can be sure a power that they believe is hostile to them doesn't use these nuclear weapons is to have their own and create a deterrent and threaten to retaliate with their own nuclear weapons if they're attacked. And so that forces this chain of proliferation. After China, you get Pakistan being the most difficult with help from China and India. But really, what happened here is India felt that it was threatened by China, so they went out, got some help, built nuclear weapons. Pakistan felt they were threatened by India. They built nuclear weapons. North Korea is kind of an outlier, but they certainly felt threatened by a lot of people, including the United States and possibly even by Russia. And Iran has certainly felt threatened by a lot of others. Israel felt threatened by non-nuclear attack as well as potentially nuclear attack. So they were motivated to get their nuclear weapons. So we have this chain continuing today, and proliferation is far from finished. I mentioned these numbers to you, so I won't reiterate them too much. This is the amount of plutonium that the International Atomic Energy Agency tracks, and that is declared to them. It continues to grow, and this is the places where there exists highly enriched uranium in civilian programs. So there's a lot of this around that's not even used in military programs today. But most of it, as you can see here, is still in the hands of Russia and the United States. There's not really very much in the non-nuclear weapon states. So most of the highly enriched uranium that's around is actually used by the nuclear powers. Now, how much of this is actually safeguarded through international safeguards? Well, that applies only to these non-nuclear weapon states. So there are no multilateral international safeguards on any of this nuclear weapons material here. It's all unilateral. Each state has its own internal responsibility for safeguarding this material, making sure it doesn't fall into other people's hands. We know that Pakistan, through their so-called A2CON network, spread a lot of technology and material to other potential proliferators around the world. Libya was one, and that was stopped. Syria is another. Maybe that's been stopped, maybe not. So this chain goes forward with all of this unsecured material. The same thing is true for plutonium, except that you have a lot of plutonium here in Japan because they use it in their nuclear power program, although they're halfway, well, they're actually more than halfway toward shutting down their nuclear power program after Fukushima. And Germany has a lot of plutonium. And there are international safeguards on these. I won't take the time here to describe the international safeguarding system, but it is run by a UN agency called the International Atomic Energy Agency. And there's an elaborate system of accounting, and you read about them in the press because it's the IAEA, for example, that has reported on Iran's refusal to disclose properly its own nuclear activities. So this is a very interesting chart done by the Nuclear Threat Initiative, an organization co-chaired by Sam Nunn. So it's an appropriate chart to put on the screen here. I might mention also that it was really Senator Nunn, along with Senator Lugar, who after the Cold War put in front of us the main issue of trying to safeguard these materials through what was called the Nunn-Lugar program. And that continues to this day, and many of you have probably heard about that in your classes and know about it. But Senator Nunn was the real leader behind trying to get the world sensitive to these issues. And he also is the co-chairman of the Nuclear Threat Initiative in Washington, which was founded by himself and Ted Turner from here in Atlanta, and is the main non-governmental organization looking after this. And they have done a very elaborate evaluation of the various safety, the various levels of safety of nuclear weapons material in various nations. And it's interesting because actually the United States is only down here about halfway when it comes to their ratings. And nobody gets above a little more than 90%. And when you get down to Iran and Pakistan and North Korea, you're down pretty low. So there is a real problem here. And those of you who know anything about simple probabilistic calculations, if the probability of a failure is more or less independent in each of these states, the probability of there not being any failure if these guys have such low ratings on their security systems is pretty low. There's going to be a failure somewhere, and some of the stuff is going to slip out. We, in fact, know that quite a bit of it has slipped out over the years. Not quite a bit of it, but quite a number of times people have been caught slipping nuclear material out of one state or another. So what do we do about this? How do we keep terrorists from getting their hands on this material? How do we create a regime of some sort that makes sure that they don't get enough material, which is only roughly 40 pounds, to make one bomb? Actually, we have a whole lot of stuff going on in the world to try to keep them from, trying to keep this from happening. There's a big arms control agenda, and I've listed a whole bunch of things here. I'm not going to go through all of these. We can talk about some of them in the discussion period if you want. We just finished another treaty with Russia. That's been important. The non-proliferation treaty is crucial. Many of you know about this. This was signed by Richard Nixon. It was started in the Johnson administration, and it's the key. It created the current, today's version, the International Atomic Energy Agency, which had actually existed since the Atoms for Peace program in the Eisenhower years, but really got underway after the non-proliferation treaty gave them the responsibility for verifying that the non-nuclear weapon states weren't building nuclear weapons. But, you know, it had flaws. In the first place, Israel didn't sign up, and they built nuclear weapons. India didn't sign up, and they built nuclear weapons. Pakistan didn't sign up, and they built nuclear weapons. North Korea signed up, but built nuclear weapons anyway and withdrew. Iran signed up, has not withdrawn, but is in violation, according to the IAEA, and clearly is moving toward a nuclear weapon. So it hasn't done its job. It hasn't kept this capability to build nuclear weapons for proliferating. The Non-Proliferation Treaty also called for the nuclear powers, the United States, Russia, China, England, France, to move to eliminate their own nuclear weapons. And that actually, believe it or not, has not happened, but a lot has happened. About 2/3 of the Cold War nuclear weapons stockpile is now out of service. Not all those weapons are fully dismantled, but they are out of service now. So the reductions that have occurred since the Cold War have been very substantial since the maximum stockpiles of nuclear weapons. But 1/3 of a number that was so huge is still very large. Today, it's thought to be about 20,000. And when Bruce did his movie, it was about 25,000. So it's continuing to reduce somewhat, but very slowly. And it's plateaued. The new treaty between the U.S. and Russia really won't reduce it any significant amount further than that. And there's no agreement on large classes of weapons. So the Non-Proliferation Treaty has not solved the problem. There's been an effort to create a treaty on fissile materials and stop the production of more fissile materials. Actually, just to show you how hard this business is, some of the states who don't have any interest in going along with this, France, Germany, the Netherlands, Japan, so those guys aren't willing to go along with this. Now, we spent a lot of time complaining about Pakistan, who blocked the beginning of the formal negotiations. So if we got Pakistan to agree to start the negotiations, we'd still have our friends not interested. So that's really not going to solve much of the problem for us. And if we go through the rest of this list, the problem is that it's like, I like to think of it like a balloon. You know, balloons don't work well if they have even a little hole in them. And this problem is like keeping air in the balloon. A little hole is all you need to create a catastrophe here. And we've got a whole lot of things that we're trying to do to keep the air in the balloon, and they've got actually some pretty big holes in them. And we're not going to get there unless we come up with some kind of a scheme which, at least in concept, doesn't have holes in it. And we don't have even that today. There's not a single proposal on the table in the world by any power, including the United States, that doesn't leave all kinds of holes in the process of controlling nuclear weapons. And even we don't do it right. Many of you may have remembered the incident a few years ago where the Air Force unknowingly loaded 4 live nuclear bombs on an airplane. Now, the Chief of Staff got fired, the Secretary of the Air Force got fired, he got fired for that, which was Secretary Gates' strength in taking some quick action on it. And so it was taken very seriously. But the mere fact that it could happen is pretty astounding when you think about it, that even we could lose track of some nuclear weapons. Russia, we know, has lost track of quite a few nuclear weapons. They don't like to admit it, but a lot of this information has come out after the Cold War. So we need something better. Now, what does better mean? It's comprehensive, universal, and enforceable. Let me run through what I mean by these. Comprehensive. It's got to cover all highly enriched uranium and plutonium without exceptions. Every gram counts. And unless we have a worldwide control scheme, a regime that ensures that all of this material is accounted for and can't go missing, we're not going to be able to solve this problem. It has to include material even in military use. And we can't just rely on the IAEA, which covers only civilian use material. We have to do military use. Now, some of this might seem to be impossible because a lot of this material is in actual live warheads. Well, if it's in a warhead, what you got to do is make sure nobody steals the warhead of the weapon. and therefore the material is not been stolen. So you really don't have to take them apart and look inside them, because a lot of people say this is a complete fantasy. No country, as long as nuclear weapons are in their arsenal, is going to allow anybody else to look at their internal workings of their weapons. Well, I'm not saying that they need to do that, but we need at least very tight inventory control on all those weapons. And the minute somebody does take them apart to dismantle them, then at that point there needs to be controlled multilateral international inspections to make sure that stuff hasn't been lost track of. Universal. This is the key point here. The logic of nuclear deterrence. The only way you can defend against nuclear weapons is with deterrence. Full stop. Someday, maybe we'll make missile defenses work. That doesn't defend against all nuclear weapons. There are a lot of ways to deliver nuclear weapons besides missiles. So if you really want to defend fully against nuclear weapons, you got to stop people hitting you with missiles. You got to stop them from flying airplanes in at high altitude. Those things are technically feasible. Very difficult, but technically feasible. But you also have to stop them from sending cruise missiles, from flying in at low altitude. You have to stop them from driving, what looks like innocent trucks over the border. 250,000 vehicles cross the U.S. border every day through Mexico. You got to stop them from flying low-level private aircraft in. You got to stop them from pleasure boats. There's about 1 million pleasure boats in U.S. waters. How are you going to do that? You're not going to 100% stop every nuclear weapon from getting in your territory. And remember, these things can be pretty small. And they're not trivial, but they can be even as small as a large suitcase. So deterrence is the only way you can stop it. The threat that someone uses a nuclear weapon against you, you will retaliate against them. That doesn't work with terrorists, because you don't know where the terrorists are, and they're not a state, so there's not much to hit back at. So for terrorists, you better keep them from ever getting one in the first place. For everybody else, you better make sure deterrence works. The only ultimate solution, of course, is to eliminate all the weapons. And that's, of course, what most of us who study this believe is the only ultimate solution. Senator Nod has been very articulate on that. He was one of the signers of the most important document advocating zero nuclear weapons that's been put out since the end of the Cold War. And but he, like I, believe very strongly that we can't get there without a realistic approach. And the first step in that approach has to be some kind of a verification regime to make sure that we know what everybody has and that we can count it and track it as we reduce towards zero. So this whole effort to simply control the nuclear material itself and therefore the nuclear weapons and who's making the nuclear weapons is an essential first step to eliminating nuclear weapons, which I would hope that you can get to. It's also an essential step if you don't eliminate nuclear weapons, because otherwise this stuff will fall into the hands of terrorists who you can't deter. So it has to be universal, because if anybody, any state has a nuclear weapon or has material that's out of control, or people think they have material that's out of control, other states will try to build their own weapons to be able to retaliate and deter an attack by that state. And it's inevitable, and you saw it in that first chart. It's happened a number of times in history, and it continues ahead. And of course, it has to be enforceable. There have to be some consequences for rule breakers. The number one problem in enforcement of all these international laws is trying to get some kind of a veto-free UN authority to take action. Because most states require, even in their own domestic laws, some kind of approval by the United States before they take military action against any other state, and they require that it be consistent with the UN Charter. Actually, every state that signed the UN Charter, in principle, has agreed to that, because that's part of the treaty that they signed to join the UN. So it's unrealistic to think we can get around the UN requirement, but it's not unrealistic to think that we can come up with a scheme that means that one member of the one of the permanent members of the Security Council can veto moving forward. That's been happening with Iran. Right now we see it with China and Russia blocking further movement on Iran. And the rest of the world pretty much has agreed to take further, stronger steps against Iran to try to get them to stop the nuclear program. But that's been vetoed by Russia and China. So how do we do that? What we suggest here is that what we have to have is enforcement in 4 stages. International monitoring, so that people know for sure what's going on. A mechanism for determining if a violation has occurred. Much like the IAEA now has that authority, the International Atomic Energy Agency, in enforcing the non-proliferation treaty. An agency to define what the enforcement options are and put those on the table, and then some kind of enforcement by a United Nations Security Council authorized coalition. So we actually propose in our article, my co-author Rick Bird and I, that the UN Security Council has the authority to pre-approve this kind of action. That a resolution could be passed with the entry into force of this kind of a treaty that would allow the formation of these coalitions to undertake this kind of tough action. And that if that is made a part of this regime from the beginning, then to say that, well, Russia and China will never agree to that, that's not exactly quite right. Because if they are going to agree to the regime itself, well, if this is part of the regime, then they should agree to go along with that and make that a part of the way the UN operates. This actually happened with Libya. The UN passed an open-ended resolution which said that any coalition of powers didn't even have to be members of well, they had to be members of the United Nations. They didn't have to be members of NATO or any other organization. To come together and take all necessary measures to protect civilians in Libya. And it didn't set time deadlines. It was indefinite in duration. So we're suggesting a resolution like that for nuclear weapons material control violations. That if any state is found to be violating the rules of the regime that we're suggesting, that a coalition of powers could come together under this UN resolution. There are a lot of details to this. It's not a trivial thing to do, but we do believe it's feasible to make it enforceable. My keys here are not quite working. All right. Now we're back on track. So what we're suggesting here is to build a new regime that starts with a new treaty that uses as its foundation the International Atomic Energy Agency and the Non-Proliferation Treaty, which have holes in them, just like the leaky balloon. But add to them a bunch of other things that were on that list of arms control initiatives that are out there that are not complete, and incorporate them into this broader regime so that nations can see that, well, this isn't going to just be another partial solution that's really not going to solve any problem anyway, so why should I go to a lot of trouble to agree to this thing? Because it's now going to be part of a comprehensive whole, which, if agreed, would actually solve the problem. So you put these into the package. There are some things that aren't in the package at all, such as verification of military-related nuclear materials and the enforcement part that I just mentioned. And from that, you would create this new regime. This is President Obama, and I'm not sure who he's shaking hands with there, probably the President of Korea. He was in Korea just this week for the Nuclear Security Summit, the second one. And its goal is the same as all the goals I've laid out here. Its goal is to deal with this problem. And it's made some progress. But this is the result. In this summit, there were a few modest but voluntary commitments. There was a commitment, but not enforceable, that states would get this convention for the physical protection of nuclear materials, which simply requires that states do what they ought to do anyway and have reasonable internal controls. Not internationally inspected, not verified, but at least they have a commitment to do it, done by 2014, because most of the states who have nuclear material haven't even agreed to this yet. So that's done. And there's some pledges to eliminate unnecessary weapons material at a further rate. So maybe instead of 4 million pounds of this material, we could get it down to 3.9 to 3.8 million pounds of this material, when what we're trying to do is keep 40 pounds out of the hands of people. So, am I against these things? No. Should we be against them? No. Probably not. Although there's an argument for being against things that are going to be so leaky and so full of holes that they make people feel a little bit better, and they make people think that they've actually made some progress, when in fact, they really haven't made any real progress towards solving the problem. And they've gotten a few people who aren't really very much a part of the problem to improve their systems, but the ones who are part of the problem, they haven't come up with a scheme that gets them inside the tent working on solving the problem. So that's the problem with the Nuclear Security Summit process right now. There's no governance to it. There's no requirement for, there's no consequences for states that don't meet their goals. About half the states that made commitments in 2010 actually met all their goals this time around, and the summit that just finished didn't have much in the way of goals. So we have to have this kind of regime, in my opinion, a global nuclear control regime, if we're going to keep terrorists from getting fissile material. I didn't talk specifically about the AQ-CON network, but people say, well, why can't we rely on each state to police itself? Well, Pakistan claims that the gentleman who sold nuclear secrets and nuclear material all around the world was a lone bad actor. Not many people actually believe that. They don't see how he could have operated without the cooperation of the Pakistani government. But nonetheless, let's take them at their word. Had there been any kind of multilateral international inspection in Pakistan, that would have been uncovered. The International Atomic Energy Agency has done a good job. They did find the Iraqi program. They did find the Iranian program. They did find the North Korean program. And they don't have a very big budget. We're proposing a budget about 100 times the size of their current $200 billion a year budget in order to police this other thing. But that's still small by current standards, $20 billion. It's pretty much of a rounding error in the $30 trillion world economy to try to solve a crucial problem. So there will be other rogue actors without this kind of a regime. At some point, we need to get the world on a path to elimination of all nuclear weapons, and you can't do that without a regime like this in place before you start down that path. You just simply aren't going to get the major powers to start down this path and give up their nuclear deterrent or go to very low levels without this kind of a verification regime in place. And finally, to create a framework for these other initiatives. All those things on that list that people are trying to do are good things. They should be done. But unless they're in a framework, which looks like if we put this whole thing together, it's actually going to solve our problem, we're just not going to get those agreed universally. And without there being agreed universally, the world has got a lot of leaks in it. And then finally, to remove a lot of diplomatic barriers to progress. One of the main problems is that many states, some legitimately, mostly just kind of complaining, say, well, you, the United States, won't accept any of these rules. You won't allow any inspectors to look at your facilities or materials or determine whether or not your nuclear materials are secure. And we know they're not entirely. You put these bombs on the plane. You make mistakes. Why don't you yourself agree to accept this? Same thing's true for Russia, France, Germany. France doesn't want anybody getting very close. China doesn't want anybody getting very close. Excuse me, not Germany, UK. So one of the first things that has to be done here is to remove the diplomatic barriers to getting other states under the inside the tent working on this problem that exists because the nuclear weapon states don't participate in this kind of an effort. So I'm going to stop at this point and open up to discussion and questions. And Simon, do you want to moderate this, or shall I just take questions from?
Usually a middleman for an audience this size accomplishes nothing.
Okay,
whatsoever.
I'd be happy to.
Let me just ask, when you have a question, please stand because of projection problems in this room. Identify yourself and then make it a question. You don't need a whole a statement from anybody. Time is limited. Make it a question for Jan. Okay?
Okay, thank you. Sir.
If I can start, my name is Donald Patillo, and I don't wish to question your excellent presentation and so on, and about the dangers that we have with nuclear proliferation and all that. But I would put it to you this way. If we went back 40 or 50 years ago and then projected forward to the year 2012, I think most people would have projected 40 or 50 years ago that somebody would have set off a bomb somewhere for some reason in that period of time, and yet we have not. And I would say it is a remarkable achievement and speaks very well for what nuclear controls we have now, however imperfect, that nobody has used a bomb since Hiroshima and Nagasaki. Now that, as I say, is a more optimistic view than what you have, but I just wondered what your reaction was.
No, I think it's a very good point, and I agree with it. So what's different? Why this now, given that history, as you said it? Two reasons. Number one, over this period of time, can you hear without the microphone, everybody? Yes? Okay. Number one, over this period of time, the technology to build a nuclear weapon was not very widely available. It was very tightly controlled. The simple knowledge, the design, the engineering of a nuclear weapon was very much of an important state secret. In the United States, actually, we have what is like the British Official Secrets Act concerning this knowledge. It's a crime to disclose this knowledge, even if you didn't have any bad intent. Even if you're a journalist, and we have the tightest controls of anything on this knowledge. Nonetheless, it's now widely available. Why? Mostly because of the spread of nuclear power. Because the technology that you need to understand in order to put together a nuclear weapon is largely, not entirely, the same as what you need to build and operate nuclear power plants. You need to be a good, strong nuclear engineer. We train thousands of them in the world now, every year. And they're dispersed all over the world. So we made this choice in the Eisenhower years, Atoms for Peace, that we would allow nuclear technology to be used for energy-creating purposes, a reasonable choice, and that we could separate that entire industry from the question of nuclear weapons. The other thing that's happened in that period of time is the end of the Cold War and essentially the monopoly on this technology of the U.S. and the Soviet Union, where we didn't have any bombs go off, thank goodness, because if they did, given the size of those arsenals, escalation would have meant an immense catastrophe, But in a way, there was a bit of a cap on proliferation because of the Cold War dynamics in world politics, which is gone now. And we see that, if Iran gets a bomb, it's going to be very hard to convince the Saudis who have the capability, the power plants, the engineers, the money, the technology, and see Iran as a mortal threat to them to not have their own nuclear weapon, for example. And once that happens, you've got a problem throughout the whole Middle East. And we could carry this example on elsewhere. And there's a variety of other situations that are much different now than they were during the Cold War and during the time when nuclear deterrence, plus the non-proliferation treaty, has kept the peace. So I think that we face, is this a threat? Is there some probability that this could happen tomorrow? Yes. It's possible. I don't think that's very likely that terrorists have been able to pull this off and that we don't have any hint of it and we don't know anything about it. But, just do the compound probabilities. If the probability is 1 minus, 10 to the minus 10, that this will happen in any 1 year, I can't do that quite in my head. But when you compound that out, the probability gets to be 50% or so in probably 100 years. And it gets to be 99% in 120 years. Just because of the nature of compound probabilities when you have so many players and so many independent ways things can happen, and so much material around. So that's why we shouldn't look at our luck as a predictor of the future.
If you'd come up to the microphone for questions, I think we would do better.
Fairly poor acoustics around the room.
So thanks for coming up, Cal.
Yeah.
A few notes. First, I'm a nuclear engineering PhD student. I have the material and capability at home
To make a nuclear weapon.
to design a nuclear weapon, at least on paper. So,
But I mean, you're not, that's not a joke, right? You're serious about that.
I'm dead serious.
Yeah, absolutely. Good. Thank you.
Now-
That's much stronger than me making the claim for you.
That being said, the reactor-grade plutonium that you cite as a potential source for nuclear weapons contains too much plutonium-240 for me to be able to make an effective weapon. And that's due to the spontaneous fission rate of plutonium. I don't want to get into the details of it, but the use and inclusion of reactor-grade plutonium as a potential source of nuclear material to be able to fabricate a bomb is not accurate. It is theoretically possible to do it. It is not physically accomplishable to be able to do it.
Yes, but my understanding is that the reprocessing capability that you would have if you're making reactor-grade plutonium is basically the same reprocessing technology that you would need to create weapons-grade plutonium.
It is. What's different is how you go about irradiating the fuel in the core. So you have to go intentionally into the process to be able to make it, which requires shorter radiation time. So reactors like CANDUs and stuff like that are pretty ideal for doing that type of material, but that's able to be identified from a control standpoint to be able to determine radiation times in the core. So that's not an accurate statement. Those numbers really for existing plutonium inventories are not accurate to be able to be a threat risk for nuclear weapons. Now, on the standpoint of probabilities, the sun has a probability of exploding at around the order of 1 times 10 to the 10th, minus 10th. Okay? That's today. Tomorrow it'll be the same. 100 years from now it'll be the same. That probability does not change. So the same thought and same logic with the probability of the 1 times 10 minus 10th that you quoted does not compound year to year to year to year. Those are discrete independent events.
Yes and no. Sorry for this technical discussion for those of you who aren't aficionados for this.
What's the question?
Yes.
My question is more of a statement about the accuracy of the statements, is that he is playing loose and fast with his technical facts. So he is, right, you flip a coin, what's probably they get heads? So say you have 10 heads in a row, you flip another coin, what's probably they get heads on the next toss?
I, believe it or not, understand that. Excuse me? That's okay. Let me try this.
Cal, you better be careful on what you're saying.
No. What Cal's saying is exactly right. It's an important point. And I will look into this business about the reaction-grade plutonium. I don't think it makes much difference because, first of all, I think the real risk is a uranium bomb. Uranium bombs are much easier to make. And not many people realize when we tested the bomb in 1945, and everybody thinks, wow, we tested it, we showed it would work, and therefore Truman decided to use it, and he went off to use it. Well, everybody got together, and the bomb we used on Hiroshima was not the one we tested. Everybody agreed that the more reliable bomb was the untested. Never tested in human history, not never tested by us, but never tested in human history, uranium bomb, and that was more reliable than the tested plutonium bomb because it's so much easier to build a workable uranium bomb. It's much harder to use uranium alone to build a very small, lightweight weapon that you can put on top of a missile and shoot, the intercontinental range. You sort of need the plutonium technology to do that. But to make a bomb that could cause massive damage in a major city, uranium's the way to go. They have to get the material. It's really not that much harder for them to steal the uranium than it is to steal the plutonium. It's a little bit harder. So that's the main thing. But there is plenty of plutonium around that I think could make at least a workable bomb. And so that's why I kind of only mentioned en passant the reactor-grade plutonium as opposed to the big stocks of weapons-grade plutonium, which actually do exist. But in terms of your other point on the probability, I think the real model here is my favorite example, one that Professor John Paulos uses in his book Innumeracy. What's the probability that the last breath you took includes at least one molecule exhaled by Julius Caesar when he said A2 Brute?
Very small.
The answer is it's infinitesimally less than 100%. The probability is 100%. And which means that every breath you take include at least one molecule exhaled in every breath that every living mammal has ever exhaled. And think about that for a while. That's a very kind of complicated thing to think of. And the reason is because you have about 1 mole of molecules. So you have about 10 to the 23rd molecules, roughly, in a breath. And you have to win 10 to the 23rd times. Now, what do I mean by win? You have to miss one of those mixed-in molecules. By the way, this only works for about 5 years ago. It takes about 5 years for the atmosphere to mix. But you have to miss every single time. And that's what the situation is that we face here. The situation is not the situation of, winning. We have, the situation of just, flipping the coin each time and caring about whether we get heads or tails on each flip. We have to get heads in a row for, literally thousands of circumstances over the period of 100 years or so. And that's why I think that your probability calculation is wrong, because we have to make sure that every terrorist group manages to that we succeed in keeping every terrorist group from getting one. We succeed in keeping every crazy leader in every proliferating country from using one. And in every world crisis, we have to succeed on all of those. So those are the probabilities that you have to compound. It's the probability of succeeding on each of those occasions over a long period of time, because what you want as an outcome is 0 failures. So you have to succeed. And those things are largely independent one of the other. There's pretty much independence between a particular terrorist group doing this in the Al-Qaeda era, or one different one doing it 10 years from now or 15 years from now, or a world in which Saudi Arabia and 10 or 15 other countries have nuclear weapons. So that's why I think it's not the independent coin flips with the same probability each time.
All right, Nick, why don't you come up?
Hi, my name is Sam Detta. I'm a PhD student in aerospace engineering, and also a Sandman Fellow. And my question was, during the Eisenhower era, and I guess later in the 60s, we did different programs to give incentives for countries to not become nuclear proliferating countries. And some of them, such as the Atoms for Peace, actually led to, for example, India getting its bomb, or getting the material to make its bomb. So what incentive can we give to people, to countries which want bombs, but we don't want them to have bombs? And how could we make sure that it doesn't, come back to us? Because you're obviously advocating a policy method of stopping proliferation. How do you achieve that, and how do you make sure that it's not going to come back to backfire?
Well, it's an excellent question, and there's no 100% answer. I'll give you my best take on it, given the way the world is. First thing is, I think that we have to keep nuclear power available for anybody who wants it. I think the cat's out of the bag on that. It's kind of unfortunate. One wishes you could go back to Atoms for Peace and think through it in a different way. But nonetheless, we decided that nuclear power was a good idea. I actually think that the contribution nuclear power can make to helping to stop global warming is important. But it's very interesting that if you look at the most optimistic projections of what nuclear power can do to reduce global warming, it's almost 10 or 20% of our problem. So, we have, there's alternatives to nuclear power to solve the global warming problem, and it doesn't solve all of it. Nonetheless, I think we can build safe power plants, and I think we can make them safe for proliferation. So the key way we proceed is we say, look, the basic deal is still on the table. You can have nuclear power. You can have Atoms for Peace. But we're going to tighten up the controls. You've got to be part of this control regime. And you've got to accept these more comprehensive controls that we're talking about now to make sure that all this stuff is safe and secure and limited to your power program. I would hope that we might be able to convince states to also use types of power programs that, for example, don't use separated plutonium in the power program, so they don't have reprocessing capability, because one thing that's for sure about plutonium, to go back to Cal's point, is that unless it's been reprocessed, you can't do anything with the way that plutonium is when it first comes out of the power plant. It has to go through a fairly complicated chemical process. Not nearly as complicated as what you have to do to enrich uranium, but it is a complicated, difficult process. So if we could stop people from using that, and they really don't need to use it, it's not economic, that would help too. So there's some things like that that we could try to do, and we can provide incentives to that by providing easier, perhaps more economical access to new uranium for their power plants and access to better technology for their power program. So I think that's the first thing we do, is we live with the basic bargain. It goes back to Eisenhower, which says that we're not trying to keep you from having nuclear power. It's your right if you want it, but you've got to accept these controls. The other thing we can do is that we can try to get people in this regime as the first step. This regime does not put any constraints in and of itself on what anybody can do with any of the nuclear programs. It just says they got to be safe, and they got to be secure, and they got to be inspected, they got to be audited. But it doesn't, in and of itself, tell anybody what they can and cannot do with their nuclear programs. I believe that's very important for this regime, because I think it's very difficult to negotiate it if we're trying to, at the same time that we're trying to get them to make them safe and secure, we're trying to get them to adopt, we're trying to control their actual activities. Now, we have a lot of other things on that list that are attempts to control their activities, mind you, and most of those states have already agreed through the Non-Proliferation Treaty not to have any nuclear weapons. So there's plenty of other things on the table that control their activities with their nuclear programs, and we should keep pushing those. But we should also try to get this regime in place, and in order to make it universal, we have to include a bunch of states that aren't going to agree right off the bat to serious controls on their nuclear program. Like, for example, all the present nuclear powers aren't going to agree to that. So that's why what Rick Burt and I try to do in this article is separate those problems so that we can begin somewhere and not have ourselves gridlocked on everything at once. So I think that's an incentive too, is to make sure that this thing clearly allows their power programs to go forward.
Actually, I have a couple of questions, but I'll just do the first one, and then later, if there's time, I'll do the second. You have mentioned a proposal for some group sponsored by the United Nations, some sort of a treaty that would provide for some group to enforce nuclear non-proliferation. This isn't something that's likely to happen, is it? China and India don't agree to things now of that nature. The United Nations in general is not proved to be very effective as an international security organization anyway. So what about the possibility in the future of things such as what is called coalitions of the willing? One example of something like that is what's known as the PSI, the Proliferation Security Initiative, which has had two, perhaps more, but two fairly notable successes. It's a voluntary, non-hierarchical regime that has been used. What do you think of the future of coalitions of the willing in this area, and specifically, what do you think of the Proliferation Security Initiative, PSI?
Well, let me try to answer this in two parts, because half of what you say I agree with completely, the other half I'd like to challenge a bit. Let me start with the challenging part. I think the United Nations has actually been quite effective in enforcing the Non-Proliferation Treaty through the International Atomic Energy Agency, which is a United Nations entity. And it's done what it's supposed to do. It's found violations, and there aren't cases that people can point to where it's failed to find violations, and it has a low budget. And so it has verified this treaty. Now, the states that you mentioned, Pakistan, India, and Israel stay outside the treaty. You mentioned China. China's not subject to its control because the treaty did not control the 5 permanent members of the Security Council who were already nuclear powers at the time. So it never had the authority to deal with any of those states, and therefore it hasn't been effective there. The Proliferation Security Initiative is fine, and as far as it goes, but it's holes in the balloon problem. It's not comprehensive. It doesn't cover all the circumstances. Now, coalitions of the willing, however, are the right way to go, and that's what I was suggesting as an enforcement mechanism. But I believe that they must operate under a United Nations sanction, because I think there's simply too many nations in the world who you would want to be inside these coalitions, who will not agree to be in these coalitions unless there's a United Nations sanction. That happened with the Libya operation. We were able to get a United Nations sanction that permitted the creation of coalition of the willing. It didn't say what the coalition had to be. It was a coalition of the willing that came together. It included Qatar, included the United Arab Emirates, the UAE in it. Not even NATO powers. Eventually it was turned over to NATO. In the beginning it wasn't stated as NATO. So it was very open-ended what this United Nations authority was. That's what we're proposing, is that along with the entry into force of this regime would be a Security Council resolution that gives states the authority to form coalitions of the willing if the designated multilateral international organization, and we suggest one and how to create it, declares that a state is not in compliance with this regime. And you've gone through a process and you've tried to bring them into compliance, and that if they're not in compliance and have been declared not to be in compliance with a non-veto process, no one state can veto this, no few states can veto this, and it's done by a technical organization that, like the IAEA or the IAEA itself, that's been shown to be able to do this. Then coalitions would be authorized by the United Nations to form, and they would form. They would not have any control. They would not be controlled by the United Nations. The United Nations would not say what they could do or how they would carry out their operations or what they would decide was appropriate. But they would have the authority to be formed. Take one example. The United Kingdom, by its own internal laws, cannot participate in an international operation unless it's sanctioned either by NATO or the United Nations, one of those two. And there are many other states with whom we have close relations that have the same laws. And in principle, one can argue that the United States has that obligation. We don't quite acknowledge it, but given that our Constitution makes treaties the supreme law of the land, and we signed the United Nations Treaty, which imposes that obligation on states, some people believe we have that obligation too. So I think we shouldn't set aside that role of the United Nations, but we need to make it effective by making sure that there's no veto over what can happen here.
But suppose that you can't get that.
Well,
There is no resolution.
Well, if you can't, if you can get the treaty, you can get the resolution, because well, if you can't get either the treaty or the resolution, you're stuck in a box we're in right now. You got a leaky balloon, and we're going to have probably somebody using nuclear weapons sometime. That's what's going to happen. And once that happens, then the world will change its approach. But that will not be pretty when that happens, and there will be a lot of draconian things happen, and there will be impacts that we don't like. So, and this we have to be willing to make clear to our partners, our allies, our friends, our enemies, and everybody that there's no real alternative to humankind here. We have to get this under control, and this is a problem we all face. So if we can't do it, if we don't have the leadership skill, if we don't have the ability to do it, if we can't get the states to do it, if we can't coerce them to join, remember, nothing wrong with coercing them to join. We can do that. But if we can't do that, we've got a situation where ultimately it seems inevitable that that one of these weapons will get used again.
Thank you. Is that it, Si, or how are we doing?
Do we have time for one more question?
My second question is
Well,
about
let's
the
see.
NPT.
Hang on. Anyone else? Do we have
I saw one at a time.
I
Sure.
got a lot of voices.
Okay.
Peter Weston, PhD student at HCS. With regard to the diplomatic overtures, is it possible, and what is your feeling on this, that in order to go forward, we have to look back a little bit in that the events of the 40s are a little still too close, generationally speaking, to really enact any changes or removals of the diplomatic obstacles in order to go forward with what you're proposing?
Well, I think I think the world is closer to actually a consensus on a lot of this than it might appear. Even in the early days of Putin, he was willing to go along with this. And, you know, Medvedev actually agreed with President Obama when he made his, after he made his strong statement in Prague about a world free of nuclear weapons. And the corollary of trying to get to a world free of nuclear weapons is that you got to create a regime like this. This actually is not the only thing you got to do to get the world free of nuclear weapons, but it's one of the necessary things you have to do. And we actually had the president of modern Russia say he was in favor of trying to bring the world in this direction. China has not particularly said anything one way or the other, but China has a very interesting policy toward its nuclear weapons. It actually does have a defensive policy. It doesn't have very many. They only have about 40 or 50 weapons that can hit the United States, compared to the thousands that we're having. I'm not saying that's trivial, but they have not built a big arsenal, and they have a no first use policy, which says we would only use these in defense. If you have a no first use policy, you have effectively said that the only purpose of your nuclear weapons is to prevent the use of nuclear weapons by others, and you have no other purpose of nuclear weapons. And when you think about it a little bit, what does that imply? That implies that if everybody else is willing to give them up, you're willing to give them up, because you have no purpose for them if others will give up their nuclear weapons. So China has effectively said they would go along with getting the world on a path to no nuclear weapons. Again, if you believe that, you believe that you have to do this. So if you look at the fundamentals, and I could go through India, Pakistan, and the other states, and how do you unravel that spaghetti chart I showed up here that showed how proliferation went in this direction, how do you turn it and make it go backwards? Sort of like a lot of time travel movies which try to show you what would happen if we could really turn time in the opposite direction. It's not quite that hard to do this. But the fundamentals are feasible if you look at it on a case-by-case basis. The diplomacy is difficult, but in my opinion, if the President of the United States were to make a major effort to do this and exercise American leadership, we still have a leadership role in the world. We very quickly get a large number of states to sign on with us. Of course, we get England, probably even get France, believe it or not, and we get virtually all the non-nuclear weapon states would sign on right away and join in this effort. And so we would be pretty far down the road, and it would be increasingly difficult diplomatically as time goes on for other states to stay outside the regime. And one could develop a variety of carrots and sticks to make it in their interest to get inside the regime. Is it tough? Yeah, it's probably the toughest diplomatic challenge we would have faced since the non-proliferation treaty or some of the other things that we faced. Is it assured that anybody can do it? No, it's not assured. But what is assured is that if we don't do something like this, the technology that underlies nuclear weapons is such that a terrorist, if they can get their hands on the material, can make a weapon, and there's lots of leaks in the system that tries to ensure that they can't get their hands on the nuclear material. And in fact, there's some leaks in the system to ensure that they can't get their hands on a finished weapon either. Some of those I've had personal experience with from my years in government, and I've seen some of those things firsthand, and it can be a bit scary at times. But when you look at it as a whole, it's hard to avoid the conclusion. I don't know anybody, any senior official who has been involved directly with the operation of these weapons and who does not believe that the system is less than perfect, and therefore over time something will go wrong. And that's military or civilian. So that's what we have to do. We have to get people on board. I think it's a lot more likely to get the world on board to try to do this kind of a regime than it is to immediately convince them to eliminate all nuclear weapons, or to give up their nuclear power, or to join in a regime that applies only to them and not to everybody. So that's why you have to have these criteria, why you have to say it's universal, why you have to make sure that we are willing to accept the same terms that we're trying to impose on everybody else. And you have to do all of these things at once in order to make it feasible, but if we're willing to do that, and there's no reason why we shouldn't. It doesn't impact our national interests to do any of those things. And it doesn't run any serious security or military risk to us in a post-Cold War world to do any of those things now. It's just a matter of getting on with it and doing it.
Okay.
Thank you very much.
Thank you very much.